Sometimes a passage will come remarkably close to home or shed some light on current social issues. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time thinking about the idea of outrage. There's a passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 5 that I'd like to remind you of. If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. All right, so if you notice, we are looking at a violation of justice and righteousness. And then Solomon says, do not be amazed at the matter. So there is oppression and injustice in a province, it says, which means sort of an area far removed from the capital, from the center, from the place where the king is. And so somebody at that distance might be tempted to consider injustice because he's so far away. Because the king is away, somebody could think maybe they could get away with it in the king's land. So we're looking at justice and oppression in a province and how that might play out. So the passage says, where there is injustice, where there is oppression, this phrase, do not be amazed at the matter, reminded me of our use today of the word outrage. Macmillan defines it as this: outrage is a strong feeling of anger and shock as something that you feel is wrong or unfair. But notice some of the words that are in blue. It is a strong feeling. It is anger, it is shock, it is a sense in which you have some righteous indignation that a thing, where you feel that a thing is wrong or unfair. And each time it uses the word feel, it reminds me of sentimentalism, out of which you had Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe would try to stoke every sensibility, every emotion toward abolition that she could. And so there was a proper use of that, but let's not jump ahead of reason and of volition. C.S. Lewis put it this way, if you've read The Abolition of Man, he said that there are three parts to man. The head is the reason, the belly is the emotions, and the chest in the middle is the will. It is governance, it is virtue. And so C.S. Lewis writes that modern education has a tendency to jump the chest, that we serve the belly, we serve the head, but we make no judgments concerning the chest. And I wonder if outrage jumps the chest as well. It tries to get to the emotions without regard to what is virtuous, what is good and beautiful, and without regard to what might be a reasonable response. So the passage talks a little bit about the nature of man, and this is what Derek Kidner says when he says, this passage says, don't be amazed. For all of his hatred of injustice, Kohelet pins no hopes on utopian schemes or on revolution. He knows what is in man. And what is in man? What is man? We've talked about it before. Being made in the image of God is an incredible blessing, responsibility, honor, as a signpost to the kind of God that we serve. And so we are made in the image of God. And I have said before in church services sometimes that when we see ourselves glorified, if we were to see someone glorified here today, we would have a strong tendency to bow down and worship. So we are made in the image of God. We have great value. And yet we are fallen creatures. Every area of our life is touched by sin. That's what depravity means. Doesn't mean we're as bad as we can be, but it means that we are touched by sin in every area of our lives. I can't go, well, my work life is a bust, but my marriage, no, everything is touched by sin. We have a marbled existence. And so Solomon is looking at that and saying, so we shouldn't be surprised, we shouldn't be outraged, we shouldn't get on our moral high horse, but instead we should realize it's more of the nature of man coming out in one way or the other. So what does a wise man do in that situation in which there is outrage and injustice? And I want you to listen to this verse from the end of chapter 4 of Ecclesiastes. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who knew no longer how to take advice. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people, all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a striving after the wind. He describes a situation in which there is an old and foolish king, a king who has forgotten how to listen, a king who has forgotten how to give justice, and then there is a young youth who is wise, and that man is able to take the place of the foolish king who has reigned for a long time because he's wise. And so, what is the role of a wise man in the midst of outrage? The first, Proverbs would tell us to do justice. The advice of King Lemuel's mother is in particular view here. Look at Proverbs chapter 31, in which she says his job is to do what is just, to defend the rights of the poor and needy, and to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. That's the proper job of those in authority and those who are wise, not just someone who would say, but I don't have any authority. We all have ability, we all have position. The poor but wise youth delivered the whole city by his wisdom. The poor but wise youth was able to bring about change when he had no position of his own, but wisdom itself gave him a voice. And so, in the midst of outrage, I want to say, instead of being emotionally driven to make a decision that has bypassed our wisdom, our virtue, our understanding, our sense of justice and propriety, instead of jumping it, find what it is and become that poor but wise youth who could, in the end, deliver the city. Solomon has said, don't be amazed at it. Don't marvel at it. There are some New Testament parallels too. When things that should horrify us and frighten us, we're also told to not be surprised. Peter says, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. John reminds us as well, don't be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. See what he's saying? Take the surprise out of it. Remind yourself again of who God is and who man is, and be wise in your responses. After all, there is a judge. So don't stumble. Don't give in to the temptation when everyone else is becoming outraged. Don't give in to the temptation to be frightened or astonished or hurried into such thoughts that might be the agenda of another person. Don't malign the character of God in the midst of stumbling over some outrage. Instead, marvel not. As if it were inconsistent with God's wisdom and justice to suffer such disorders. For he that is higher than the highest, the Most High God, who is infinitely above the greatest of men, he regards all things, not like an idle spectator, but as a judge who diligently observes and will effectually punish. So don't be amazed, but use wisdom. This is not an excuse to not be involved. It is to know how and why and when to get involved in order to change the course of injustice, to make things right, to make things just. So that's the person that we want to cultivate inside each one of us. Thanks for hanging out.